Hello! In the last video, we considered the fact that Paul was either lying, honestly mistaken, or correct about his claim that there were 500 witnesses of the risen Jesus. As touched on in the last video, it would have been quite unlikely for Paul to lie. As revealed in his letters to the Corinthians, he had a relationship with the church and cared about his reputation.
Paul assumed responsibility for the tradition that he passed, and Paul cared about his reputation with his audience in Corinth, and the cost of false confirmation would have been very high for Paul. So given which, Paul would have been very careful to make sure that he passed on what he knew is true.
This was the point that on round one, I kind of just dismissed as inference. And as much as I'd like to do a full court press and dig in to justify my conclusion of unsupported inference, for the sake of time, today I'm going to grant Dr. Loke this point as expressed in the black banner of this slide for the sake of discussion, because all it really says is that Paul would have wanted to be sure he was correct. And I'm happy to grant that Paul really thought he was correct. That has no bearing on whether he was actually correct, but Paul was confident in his conclusions. No doubt.
So Paulogia thinks that he would have better luck arguing that Paul was mistaken rather than lying. Coolio. Now, the problem for Paulogia is that, first and foremost, all the considerations that applied to the Corinthians in terms of their ability to check out the existence of the eyewitnesses would have applied to Paul personally as well. Paul himself was an avid traveler, Paul knew there were Jewish feasts in Jerusalem that would have large portions of Christians at one time, and so on. And, as Larry Hurtado points out, Paul was also well acquainted with a wide variety of Christian circles very early on. He would have been involved in these circles years before writing 1 Corinthians, and the eyewitnesses would have been well known within these groups due to the foundational importance of what they witnessed. As an analogy, if you were part of a church for some time, you would know the identity of the pastor there. Because of your involvement in this circle of people, you would come to be aware of such essential information. So, Paul's involvement in these groups would have given him access to information surrounding these eyewitnesses, making it unlikely that he was mistaken about them. Another point, before we're done, is that Paul wasn't the only one who was sharing the tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. The letters of Paul indicate that he knew others, like James, Peter, and other apostles, whom he mentioned as eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, and that he had personally met them and talked to them, and that he knew that the Corinthians knew them too. As Christopher Bryan comments, some among the Corinthians were certainly familiar with the teachings of Cephas. See 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12. Evidently, they knew who James was and were aware of other apostles, chapter 15, verse 8. And it is hardly likely that none among them had never heard any of them teach. In other words, the assertion of eyewitness testimony, made both by Paul and by the apostolic formula, was easily open to challenge unless, as must have been the case, he and the Corinthians knew perfectly well that it was correct. As the series progresses, we're seeing more and more reasons to think that Paul was correct when he said that a large number of eyewitnesses claimed to see the risen Jesus. But we still haven't gone over all the reasons Dr. Loke presented in his written opening statement. Don't worry, we'll get to all those, Lord willing, but that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoy this content.